Mr. Bremmer, really appreciate your time here on NDTV. What implications do you think the attempted assassination of Donald Trump will have on the political landscape of the United States in the short term and also in the long term?
A couple of things in the short term. First, it is a boost to Trump. The fact that he stood up immediately after being shot with blood on his face, with a fist raised, and said, "Fight, fight, fight." That is an iconic image that I think will go down in history in the United States, but certainly will be replayed over and over and over again across the media and by Trump and his supporters and his campaign itself. It will strengthen support for Trump individually. The Make America Great Again, MAGA movement is very much not just a populist movement, but also has a level of reverence for the individual of Donald Trump. That will get stronger. He will appear in Milwaukee on Monday at the Republican National Convention as Lazarus risen. And there will be incredible support. It certainly makes it more likely that he wins the presidency in the U.S. On the Democratic side, it makes it less likely that Biden stands down. There's been a lot of pressure. It's dominated the news cycles for 2 weeks now since a disastrous debate that Biden had against Trump. There was a lot of internal opposition in the Democratic Party against Biden. That is now off the headlines in the most tragic way possible. Biden had not been inclined to personally step down, but everyone around him was telling him they needed to. Now he has more time to resist that. The story has moved elsewhere. If he wants to stay, he's more likely to be able to stay. So in the near term, those are the political implications. There's also, of course, the potential for much more violence, much more social instability at a time when Americans are highly polarized and are being fed enormous amounts of disinformation about treating their political opponents as enemies to democracy in the United States. And that's, of course, part of why we are in the environment that we are today.
And Mr. Bremmer, since you speak about polarization, how do you think this event will impact what is evident polarization and division within the American society, and what are likely to be a potential geopolitical consequences?
Well, what it needs to happen is a 9/11 type response where the United States rallies together and denounces political violence of all sorts and does so together as one united American people. What I fear is going to happen is much more like January 6th, where for a couple of days and weeks, a lot of Americans were denouncing violence, and you saw Democrats and Republicans saying this is horrible, this is not tolerable, we need to move past this together as a nation and rebuild. But very quickly, January 6th became a threat to democracy for Democrats, but for Republicans, these were patriots who should be lionized and are heroes. And I fear that while today there is a large amount of outrage across the political spectrum, that it will be weaponized in short order. We saw some of that from J.D. Vance and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others on the right. And we have to see how Trump responds. Trump himself, Joe Biden, of course, came out and gave a very unifying statement. Also, Michael Johnson, the Speaker of the House on the Republican side, gave a very unifying statement this morning. But it's really about Trump himself. He was the one that could have been killed. He was this close from a political assassination. And if he wanted to stand and be a leader and try to unify the people, to use this to rally a cause that is greater than him, he is in a unique position to do that. Unfortunately, there is nothing about his history that implies that he will do that. His personal instincts move him in exactly the opposite direction. Make it about him, and make it about enemies to him, and dividing the country into us versus them. That is how he made his billions. It's also how he became president in the first place. Geopolitically, the United States, of course, is still by far the most powerful country in the world, militarily, economically, and technologically. And we saw that on display at the 75th anniversary of the NATO summit in Washington that I attended last week. But America's political system is in crisis. The U.S. democracy is in crisis in a way that is not true in your country, in India, not true in Europe, not true in Japan, not true in South Korea. And others around the world, allies around the world, are deeply troubled about that, a country that they rely on, that they need to be stable, but that they're very worried about. And America's adversaries, particularly the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians, think this is great news, think it's an opportunity. You will note that around the world, most leaders denounced the violence, but the Russians said, no, this is all about Biden. Biden is the one that weaponized the environment. He's the one responsible for this. The Russians are the ones that are pouring gasoline on the fire. They want the U.S. system to collapse, and they will do everything in their power through disinformation and espionage and asymmetric warfare to facilitate that.
Okay. In your opinion, Ian Bremmer, what does this incident reveal about the current state of political extremism and violence in the United States? And why do you think it hasn't been addressed?
Well, the United States, in addition to being the most dysfunctional of major democracies, also has by far the largest amount of gun ownership, and that includes military-style weaponry. The only country in the world that has more gun ownership than the U.S. is Yemen, and Yemen is in the middle of a civil war, so they actually need those guns. The United States does not. And that, plus a lot of mental illness that has gone unaddressed, and a lot of drug use to debilitating levels and homelessness that has gone unaddressed, has created a much more violent environment, and has created the tinder for an explosive political environment. Now, the reason we haven't seen more political violence in the United States is because the U.S. devotes an incredible amount of money and resource to preventing it. The security side, the surveillance, the intelligence, the monitoring, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and others working together to try to ensure that threats can be neutralized before they are executed. And if you look at the Secret Service, I mean, there's no other democracy in the world that has the level of security around their leaders that the United States does. So, I mean, you know, a part of the question here is not only why hasn't there been more political violence at the broad-based level, which is clear, that is a big question, but also why was the Secret Service caught so unawares yesterday? And I mean, this was clearly a major failure for the Secret Service, and there will be a lot of investigation into what happened that allowed a shooter to get so close to former President Trump and pop off 6 to 8 shots, including one that hit him in the head before he was taken out.
So how do you think the US government and intelligence agencies will respond to this attempt on Trump's life? And what measures will be taken, according to you, to prevent similar incidents in the future?
Oh, I mean, clearly you're going to have much more security. I mean, anyone that travels to the White House knows it's very different than it was before 9/11. It's very different than it was, you know, when I was a kid. That's a depressing thing, but it's a reality. You experience the same security in U.S. airports. I suspect we are moving much more towards monitoring of individuals, much more, sort of, you already see that you have the ability to give biometrics as part of your driver's license and part of your passport. This is going to be tied to people and access to buildings and public spaces and the rest. There'll be a lot more of that. So you know who is there and who is not there. You have a lot more transparency around it. You have a lot less privacy personally. So there are a lot of individual and human rights issues that come with that. There will also be just generally much heavier security around senior political officials.
Mr. Bremmer, last question to you. What message do you think this event sends to other countries and leaders around the world? And how will it really impact America's credibility and its influence on the global stage?
The United States, when I was a student, was admired politically. The U.S. won the Cold War with its allies because its ideas were better, its values were better, its political system was better. People behind the Iron Curtain wanted a political system that ran more like the United States. Now, today, the United States is still by far the strongest military, the global reserve currency in the US dollar, the best educational system in major universities, the resources in oil and gas and food, the technology and artificial intelligence and biotech and space, so many things. And yet no one around the world looks at the American political system and says, I wish my political system worked like that. The US political system is not admired. It is a democracy in crisis. Americans do not know and do not agree on what American values are today. And that is not a sustainable trajectory politically for my country.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us here on NDTV and sharing your thoughts.